My name is Matti Bunzl, and for the last 5 years, I've had the extraordinary privilege of serving as the artistic director of the Chicago Humanities Festival. And thank you. And in the 5 years that I've served as artistic director, I have never once had myself on stage because I'm very shy, and I'm actually very nervous right now. But when Marshall Sahlins agreed to join us for the Journeys Festival, and especially when it became clear that it might be my last, it became too much of an opportunity to pass up. I could give a very, very long introduction of Marshall Sahlins. I could list all of his books, but a lot of this will become clear in the course of our conversation. So I will simply say that Marshall Sahlins has been at the absolute forefront of anthropology for the last 60 years. He was a professor at the University of Michigan for a long time, until 1973, when he became a professor of anthropology at the University of Chicago. I myself got my PhD at the University of Chicago, and which is another way of saying that I was a student in the department that Marshall Sahlins presided over. I didn't have the nerve to be his student directly. I was too intimidated by his brilliance and genius. But now that my PhD is behind me, almost 20 years, I have the nerve to address him directly. And I'm about to say something that he will be upset about, but that's okay. We're really fortunate to be in the presence of the greatest living anthropologist in the world today. It is true, and it gives me great pleasure and great pride to introduce to you Marshall Sahlins for our conversation. Marshall, please come on.
All I gotta say is, if I'm the greatest living anthropologist, that longevity must be a good career move.
See, that's the problem of complimenting people like Marshall. So, I just want to jump right in. I mean, I want to cover your career because it is an extraordinary career, 60 plus years at this point. It's really it's astonishing.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I have to tell everybody that being 83 is really the new 82.
Some of you know that Marshall is also, of course, the brother of the late Barney Sahlins, and we always knew as
That's
anthropology.
already evident, I think.
Well, as students of anthropology, we always knew that the anthropologist was the funnier of the two. So, before we go into your career specifically, because here we are, I'm an anthropologist. You're, of course, one of the great anthropologists. But we still encounter the whole question of what is anthropology and why do we need it, and who better to tell us than our leader? What would be your pitch to what we uniquely have contributed and continue to contribute as a discipline?
Oh, well, you might be surprised by the statement that I want to defend, which is that I think that we have a greater assurance of the truth of our work than physicists do. And the reason is, I think, put it this way, if you're a physicist and you're dealing with this, composition of the table, the more you know about the table, the less familiar it is to anything that you know. So that, you know that it's made of molecules with spaces in between, but by the time you get to quantum mechanics, you're dealing with something that's totally foreign to human experience. Like things have to be in the same thing has to be in two different places at the same time. On the other hand, if you take anthropology, I think goes the other way around. You start with something that is really strange, like, say, something I worked on, cannibalism in the Fiji Islands. And that, it's not only strange, but probably repulsive to a lot of us. But I'll start with something that a Fijian chief said to a famous anthropologist in the 1920s. He said, after this chief explained that he was giving a feast to his carpenter who had made a great double canoe for him of a very important item. And he said to his carpenter, you know, I'm very sorry that I can't give you a raw woman or a cooked man. He said, but Christianity has spoiled our feasts, he said. So the first thing an anthropologist would wonder about is, you know, what is a cooked man? What is a raw woman? And why are they equivalent? And of course, a cooked man is a cannibal victim. And a raw woman is the daughter of a virgin daughter of a chief. The reason they're equivalent, as you find out if you stay there long enough and talk long enough, is that a cooked man is given as a sacrifice to the gods, who thereupon bestow fertility on the people, including the fertility of women and the fertility of the crops, as a benefit of the sacrifice. And a raw woman is a direct means of the reproducing the society. So the two of them are equivalent. That also helps explain why in certain parts of Fiji, in order to betroth a woman, you have to give a fine war club to her younger brother. The fine war club then procures a victim, a cannibal victim, which is the equivalent of him losing his sister. Well, I see some people nodding in agreement, even through this light. Consider that you're now think of this as logical. What first was repulsive is now something logical, but consider, moreover, that logic is something going on inside you, and that you've been able to incorporate within yourself the way this thing is put together in another society. And you have that privilege because you're human, like the people concerned, and they are meaningfully constructing their existence, and you as a human being can understand and traffic in meanings, given even foreign meanings, given sufficient time and explanation. So anthropologists have the privilege of understanding others in a way that's fundamentally more powerful than any physicist can do, because we can make within our own minds, we can reproduce within our own minds the way that the world is put together for other people. Now, this is an extraordinary privilege and the extraordinary adventure of anthropology.
That's an amazing and beautiful answer. I want to take that answer back to the beginning, because one of the things that and we've had conversations like this before, and I've always found it remarkable that even as a very, very young man, you were drawn to anthropology. And I presume that the answer you just gave, which is such a refined and sophisticated answer and really powerful, I wonder, was something like that already in your mind because it was in the late 40s, right, that you started anthropology? I mean, what was anthropology to you in high school and in college that you, even as a 20-year-old, said, that's my career?
Well, for one thing, it protected me from being a doctor, which is what my father was.
Well, you became a doctor of sorts.
Yeah, but don't ask me to cure yourself. I don't know. I think as an adolescent, I read a lot of books about Indians, about, you know.
You grew up right here in Chicago, right?
Yeah. The crooked tree in the tall pine forest has not spoken with a forked tongue, or things like that. And when I went to college, I decided that I wanted to learn more about Indians and about other peoples. So I declared myself an anthropologist from the beginning, and when I freshman orientation, which was a shock to everybody because nobody knew what anthropology was.
How did you know? I mean, it's one thing to like, you know, be interested in Indians. I mean, this is at a time when anthropology was beginning to make strides in the culture at large, but it was still very early on.
Yeah, I read a few books of anthropologists, many of whom are not worth mentioning now. But I knew that was the field that studied others. There was also the notion, there was also something fundamental about about crediting other societies. Levi-Strauss once defined anthropologists who criticize their own society by crediting the existence of others. and I've always been sort of critical of our own society in many ways. And I think this pushed me into a study of others and appreciation of the variety of human experiences.
And what was it? So you tell us where you went to college and what was it like to study anthropology?
Well, I was first course was Introduction to Anthropology. At that time, maybe there were 30 people in the course. When I taught it, about 8 or 9 years later, there were 400.
University of Michigan.
University of Michigan. We had a compendium of a textbook that talked about the variety of everything, and it was a kind of what we used to call an among the and among the so and so they do this, and among the so and so and that was what anthropology primarily was.
There was a lot of that. It was a lot of almost folkloristic a little bit. But you didn't arrive at a moment that you then became a key part of a new systematization, right? Because the way that when I got into anthropology in the 1990s, we thought of the late 40s and 1950s and some of the folks you studied with, people like Leslie White and Julian Stewart, as innovators who were quite tired of the so-and-so do this, the so-and-so do that. They had a much bigger project, right?
My primary teacher was Leslie White, who was a famous radical. It turned out he was a closet socialist during the McCarthy era. I didn't know that. Nobody did that was working there. But he was also a promoter of notions of cultural evolution. And I started off, at least it organized the world into stages and categories of development that had transcended this among the so-and-so type of anthropology. So I did start that way.
But let's stay there for a second, because I've always found so compelling. There was tremendous there was a moment of scientific optimism at that moment.
Oh, yes.
Can you because and the reason I emphasize that, and you know where I'm going, is that right now in anthropology, some of us, or there seems to be a sense of a lack of that kind of optimism. But you guys felt, there were very few of you. It was a small discipline, but you felt, if I understand it, as a true scholarly vanguard. You were gonna really change the way we think about humankind.
We were going to put this on a scientific basis.
And what would that mean? What could you do?
Well, we could develop laws of the evolution of culture. That's what Leslie White was into. The culture evolves as the amount of energy per capita per year is appropriated and so forth. So he had laws of cultural evolution. We thought we were going to put this on a positivist scientific basis. But I gave up that pretty soon. I found a big hole in Leslie White's theory.
And what was that? I know that one thing was that even though he was sort of a Marxist, he had never read Capital. But that was not your criticism, was it?
Well, it was actually. He always said he couldn't get past the first chapter of Capital.
That is a difficult chapter.
Difficult. Yeah. No, the whole I found in his theory is very technical, but he said, culture evolves as the amount of energy harnessed per capita per year increases, and that's what makes the agricultural revolution in the Neolithic more developed communities politically, religiously, etc., than hunters and gatherers. But I pointed out that there were no mechanical sources of energy, by and large, in the Neolithic, so the amount of energy harnessed per capita per year was the same in the Paleolithic and the Neolithic, namely the amount of energy that human beings produce, which is about 1/50th horsepower per hour. And when I told him this, he said, "That's irrelevant, Mr. Sahlins."
Wow.
So that became a new verse of the song we used to sing as a graduate student, because he believed Lewis Henry Morgan was the truth. This is the 19th century.
Lewis Henry Morgan, the great
evolution.
19th century progenitor of modern
So we had
American
a song,
anthropology.
it was good for Lewis Morgan. It was good for Lewis Morgan. It's good enough for me. And the new verse was, that's irrelevant, Mr. Sahlins. It's irrelevant, and it's good enough for me. So I went on to other things. I once heard Paul Bohannon, an anthropologist, describe his career in a way that I think of mine as well. He said, I fell at the feet of many people during my life. I mean, he said, Malinowski, Radcliffe Brown, Marx, so on. But I always picked myself up and dusted myself off.
Well, that leads me. I mean, those are all great anthropologists to fall down on. I mean, you already mentioned Claude Lévi-Strauss at some point. I mean, walk me through it, because I know that your reorientation, your break in a way with Leslie Whitean evolutionism had something to do with your relationship with Claude Lévi-Strauss,
Well,
or did that precede it? Tell how did this come
people
about?
think of it that way. First of all, there was no break in an important sense, because Leslie White, apart from his evolutionism, understood the symbolic character of culture, that it was meaningfully constructed in the way that I tried to talk about Fijian cannibalism. And he advanced and defended this position throughout his lifetime. And the connection to Levi-Strauss is that Levi-Strauss has essentially the same position.
So we need to pause. So when you say that culture is symbolically constructed, what is the basic meaning of that? Because it is one of those sentences that we say quickly, but the ramifications are actually enormous.
Well, take Leslie White's, one of his famous examples. He says, no ape can tell the difference between holy water and distilled water. Because it's chemically the same. But holy water has attached to it, the distilled water of holy water has attached to it all these meanings of sacredness, absolution, and so forth, which an ape could not understand. And it's true about all our lives, including our technical activities, that they're organized by meanings. I mean, think of our production. Think, for example, of the American food system. For one thing, it's a very standardized food system. Breakfasts are almost always the same thing. A very restricted amount of things, cereal, bacon, and eggs, but a very restricted diet, which we often take individually because we're in a hurry or the kids are going to school or whatever. Lunch is a more sociable activity, but usually not with the family, with colleagues, and it involves a more varied diet. Dinner, if you go shopping for dinner, you always think, if I had beef last night, I'm not going to have it again. Or if I had fish last night, or if I had fried things last night, I'm going to have broiled things or something else tonight. So the dinner is the most diverse activity, also the family's most sociable activity, and it's celebrated by this diversity. We might even go out to dinner in a Chinese restaurant, for example. So diversity increases throughout the day. Now, that means that our production is organized by this. This is a meaningful system of sociability, which involves the appropriation of the foreign in the domestic as a way of magnifying the value of the domestic. And as we go through the day, we manifest this. Well, that's a meaningful construction of our diet, which means there's a meaningful construction of our productive system, of what we produce on the land and how we organize it. So that even when it comes to what are economic matters, what the economists in fact call exogenous things like people's tastes, which there's no going behind, are in fact the things that are organizing the economy. I mean, economics is in this curious fix of banning what determines the economic system from the economy. It's called exogenous factors. It's called non-economic
exogenous,
factors.
non-economic.
Non-economic factors. But But anthropology, I think the notion of culture is a powerful one because we understand through it the symbolic, the meaningful constitution of our lives from breakfast on.
I love it. When I arrived on campus, you had just had a debate with Gary Becker. And of course, everyone in anthropology thought you had won because you had proved conclusively that...
My wife didn't.
Let's go back to Levi-Strauss, because of course, and Claude Levi-Strauss is truly, you know, a giant in our discipline. And I'd love for you to give us a sense of his revolution, because one of the things that happened, Levi-Strauss really started publishing, well, actually, the US was very important. I mean, he came into his own intellectually as an exile during World War II, and he actually learned a great deal from American anthropology, from Franz Boas, in particular, Franz Boas, the founder of American anthropology. But then he went back to France, and he really revolutionized, truly revolutionized anthropology, really starting in the 50s and then the 60s. And you were one of the people who realized and grasped that revolution immediately. And then you actually went to Paris to work with him directly. And I'd love for you to share what that was like, that moment of intellectual exhilaration.
Well, it was 68. I mean, it was a revolution in many ways. And in fact, a revolution which ended Levi-Strauss's dominance in French philosophy, because the watchword of the events in Paris in 68 was structuralism has gone down into the streets.
So we need to explain. So Levi-Strauss stood or stands for a set of presuppositions that are often labeled, or usually labeled, structuralism. What would be your definition of structuralism, or at least how you guys thought about it?
Well, my definition of structuralism, well, I had this experience with Levi-Strauss. I gave a seminar in his laboratoire, in his laboratory at the College of France, on some economic activities of Australian Aboriginals and New Guinea people on these trade systems. And I started off by saying I wasn't a structuralist, that in fact I was not going to talk about the exchange of words, which is fundamental in structuralism, or the exchange of women, which was fundamental to his whole notion of social organization and how it developed.
The exchange of women between clans or families, where the exchange of women by marriage creates social relations.
Which he thought of as the beginning of all kinship. But I'm going to talk about economic things, really the real stuff, not all this la-di-da symbolism. So I gave my paper, and Levi-Strauss in his seminar, if he liked you, he said something nice, and if he didn't, he killed you. And he liked me because basically I was the court jester of his seminar. Because French students are taught from first grade on, from the first elementary school on, to be careful about what they say because they might sound ridiculous. So there's never any discussion after a seminar, no questions. Everybody's afraid of being ridiculous, and I wasn't afraid of being ridiculous, so he liked that. So he liked me and said, but you are a structuralist, he said after my seminar. You are a structuralist because this system you talked about in Australia, it's just like the marriage system I talked about. And this one you talked about in New Guinea, it's like the other marriage system. These are structural phenomena. So I said, what I thought you said, which he did say, that infrastructure, that's economic matters, belongs to Marx, and that we deal with the science of the superstructure, which you said on page 130 of The Savage Mind. And he said, well, I did say that. He said, but we have to change now. He said, my problem was that I learned anthropology at the feet of the American anthropologists like Boas and Lowy, who were dealing with reservation Indians and trying to get out of reservation Indians something that happened in the 1860s. And so they were doing what he called the archaeology of the living. Mm-hmm. And he said, but now they weren't interested in what was going on in the reservation or the problems of the reservation or the problems of their relationship to the society at large, et cetera. But now we have to deal with those things, so we have to extend structuralism to the infrastructure. So I said, well, I thought it was a matter of principle, that it doesn't apply to the infrastructure. So I have to ask you, what is structuralism? So he said in French, well, he said, it's good anthropology. C'est la bonne anthropologie. So I said, d'accord, je suis structuraliste. I am a structuralist.
Oh, that's
But what
marvelous.
his revolution, I think, more importantly consisted of was the ability, was this thing, something like I talked about on Fiji and cannibalism. Up until then, when we did studies of comparative studies of other societies, we just tended to put them in categories and then make generalizations about the relations between these categories, Neolithic, Paleolithic, etc. Hunters and gatherers, agriculturalists, state societies. But what Levi-Strauss did was prove, I think, in a way, fundamental way, that these societies were constructed by people just as smart as us, going on for thousands of years, and that they were very much more complicated and interestingly complicated than we would just put them in a pigeonhole and then forget about them because our interest was in the law, not the case. But Levi-Strauss put us on the case, and he made us understand these societies with a depth of their logical and other conditions, the way they were put together, with a depth that was lacking previously in our notions of science.
Yeah.
So I think that it was that. And his ability to see the structures. I mean, it becomes a thrill when you've been in a field and you worked very hard on the field and you're working on your notes and you suddenly see that the marriage system is fundamentally related to the political system.
Yep.
That they're fundamentally complements of each other, and that they are related to the division of labor in the society, and they're related to the way people go out and work and so on. And when you see these connections, Levi-Strauss put it once that the myths think in you. These societies think in you, just the way we talked about cannibalism. They think in you, you become immersed in the logic of it to the point that you produce their culture. You actually produce their culture in the connections you've made. And that is a moment in anthropological endeavors that's so precious and so powerful. It makes you weep.
It is. It really is. It's one of the reasons why I joined this tribe.
Yeah.
And to work with you. You then did something, working in part from within the paradigm of structuralism, but also, going back to American traditions such as the one by Franz Boas. And this is really the moment I encountered you personally. So when I first read your work, still in college, and was getting ready to come here to the University of Chicago to study, is the way, the sort of reductive way that we thought about it is that you had found a way to correct one huge problem in structuralism. And the way it was taught to us was structuralism has this incredible power to do this relational work where all these different structures become mutually intelligible as forming some larger whole. But the weakness, as it was always portrayed to us, was that it couldn't adequately deal with history. History was unsystematic, and and a proper structuralist would not look into the past because that kind of synchronic systematicity could not be attained. Of course, really starting in the 70s and then in the 80s, you really worked on that problem. And when I encountered you, the breakthrough you had made was to basically articulate a paradigm that was simultaneously historicist and structuralist, to think about history in structural terms and structure in historical terms. Can you tell us why Captain Cook was murdered? Because that is how you figured this out.
Well, first of all, I have to tell you that Matti Bunzl wrote the definitive chapter about the history of anthropology on this matter of the relation of American Anthropology and its German roots. And when he talked about Boas, he was talking about the work he did. So he gets a lot of credit for extremely important work. Secondly, I said in passing that in '68, structuralism went down in the streets as the cry was, and it meant to the people in France that structuralism was finished because this was real action, and structuralism had to do with cemented structures that didn't change, that were fundamentally, responded to the French saying, the more it changes, the more it remains the same. But I got involved in working in history because I was working in Hawaii on 19th century organization of Hawaiian society, and more I got interested in the way it was changing. And I noticed that the way it was changing was, in fact, structurally consistent with the way it was before, given the conditions in which it was operating. But the particular issue that Matti is talking about, namely Captain Cook, it struck me that one had to analyze Cook's death in a way that responded to the way that Hawaiian culture was organized. And it turns out that Cook came to Hawaii at just in his second visit, at just the moment when they had an important ceremony in which the indigenous god, the original god of the people, who had been thrown out but promised to return annually to fertilize the land, just when that ceremony of his return was going on. And when Cook landed, the Hawaiians took him to a temple and put his arms out, stretched out, and thus forming the perfect image of the God image, which they used to carry around, which was a big, tall image with a horizontal bar and so on. So that Cook was, in fact, greeted as an instantiation of their original God, something that he didn't mind at all. He never protested. Unfortunately, his own journal is never found, so we don't know exactly what he understood, although the journal of other peoples understood it quite well, that he was called Lono, this god, and that he was taken as a visitor. Well, that god is, during the course of these ceremonies, is finally, in fact, killed and dismantled and the king, who was in abeyance during this period, comes back into power. In fact, he comes from overseas like Cook did, and he withstands a challenge of a mock battle, and he wins the battle, goes to the temple, dismantles the god, and becomes the king, who was in abeyance during the fertilizing journey of Lono. So Cook left on time, all right. I mean, he left all right, and he could have escaped. He could have also escaped if he knew how to swim, but he didn't. But it turned out that his mast, the mast of the ship broke while he was a few days out, and they had to return to Hawaii to fix a new mast, which meant that he was coming back way out of character. He was coming back to challenge the king. And at that moment, the Hawaiians, who had been loving of him, giving him presents and so on, especially the chiefs, turned against him. And there was a strong opposition. And when somebody stole the cutter of the Resolution, his ship, he went to take the king hostage until they would return it. But that was an incendiary act. And he was on shore with a bunch of Marines and was attacked. The Marines, most of them swam out and escaped, but he didn't know how to swim. So he was calling his ships to come in, and he was killed from behind as an enemy of the king. So this was obviously a structural problem. I mean, he was out of character, he was out of season. He was a threat. Why was he a threat? It depends on the structure of the ceremony. and the system in place. And so he died.
And of course, it brilliantly explains why he was welcomed earlier. And then
Right.
that because prior to your intervention, this was one of the many episodes where seemingly native minds do seemingly irrational things.
Yeah.
And of course, you explained it brilliantly by showing that there was a specific structural rationality.
Yeah, he probably got the greatest welcome of any European explorer, and certainly in the Pacific and Hawaii. I mean, people were beside themselves with joy. I mean, he's really coming back, and there's great things that they were bringing in that they never had before, iron and so on. And it was a great bonanza, so it's true.
Yeah.
So we have to talk about the way the categories are put at risk by events, the way that the meanings are put at risk by events, and thereby changed in ways that are logical given those meanings and those events. And so you have to put structure into history to understand what's going on. And also, you have to understand that at certain moments, a structure empowers certain individuals, but it doesn't determine what they're going to do. I mean, Cook was empowered at Lono, but it didn't determine that he couldn't swim. So the fact that he couldn't swim killed him. And note that if he had gotten away, it would have been okay structurally, because he'd gotten away. If he got killed, it would have been okay structurally. So you can't predict exactly what's happening without the contingency of history and of individuals who get empowered by historical moments of structural importance to do certain things, but are not determined in the way they're going to act.
I can't stress enough. I mean, what Marshall just articulated was completely revolutionary for me. I mean, if you look at my work, for example, and this is how anthropology works. So as anthropologists, we develop our theories based on our work on specific instantiations. So Marshall is an expert on Oceania, and specifically this work on history and structure came out of this work on Captain Cook and other work in Oceania. But for someone like me, if you look at my work on Central European history, I adopted that very principle. So thinking about something like the Holocaust it's an extraordinary challenge because we're presented with something that seems completely irrational, and it presents all kinds of questions about categorizations. How does this make sense? How could this possibly make sense? And as scholars, we're trying to make sense. We're trying to find certain plausibilities, certain rationalities, and Marshall, by introducing the notion of structure into the seeming randomness of historical flow, gave us an incredibly powerful way to look at history and culture, and I'm not the only one. I mean, you've changed the way a lot of us approached the research we do. I want to totally shift gear because we're getting rid of that. Because the one thing you're sitting here dapper, and the season statement. You're quite the rabble-rouser. So let's talk a little bit about Marshall Sahlins, the activist, and I will just say one thing. As if you have a sense of Marshall's extraordinary accomplishments as a scholar. This man is also the inventor of the teach-in. The teach-in. You've all heard of the institution of the teach-in. This man invented it. So tell us. This is University of Michigan, right, in the 60s.
1965. Well, if you really want to know, you could read the Senate. There's a Senate subcommittee on communist infiltration of the Vietnam War protests. And there's a footnote, I think it's on page 6. And that footnote describes the invention of the teach-in very accurately, which is interesting because only 5 people were there and I didn't tell them. But the way that teach-in was invented, it had to do with Levi-Strauss, as we'll see in a minute, but what happened was that about 25 or 6 people at the University of Michigan were very disgusted after Johnson started bombing North Vietnam, after he had been elected as the peace candidate and people had worked for him against Goldwater, who threatened to accelerate the war, and Johnson was going to be. And then Johnson goes and bombs North Vietnam in February of 1965. And that exercised a lot of people, including me, and 26 of us decided that we have to go on strike and talk about Vietnam, not the university. Well, immediately, everybody came down on our head, our colleagues, the president, the provost, the dean, the governor of the state of Michigan, who was George Romney's father.
Mitt Romney's father.
Mitt Romney's father, George. They all came down on, and the Ann Arbor News, and they all came down on our head. And unfortunately, about half or more of the people who wanted to go on strike were not tenured. They didn't include me, I was tenured, but a lot of them were not tenured. Some of them were even just teaching assistants, graduate students. Wow. Mm-hmm. So they were very vulnerable to this criticism because their futures are at stake. So you see, even when the recent protest at Chicago about the Confucius Institute, 110 people signed the protest, there was only one assistant professor. It's a dangerous activity to protest against your university if you don't have tenure. So those are the five of us who were worried about these people when this protest broke out, decided to meet one night at the home of one of us, Arnie Kaufman, a philosopher. There was one other philosopher, Friedrich Bergman. There's another anthropologist, famous anthropologist, Eric Wolf, myself, and a sociologist. And we're sitting around and thinking about how we're going to save the rest of this, save this action, and save the people at the same time. So I'm sitting there. It was in the 60s. Now, Levi-Strauss was translated a lot in the 60s. And I had just reviewed his book on the savage mind for the Scientific American. And so things like binary oppositions for which he was famous. That is, oppositions, every thought being an implication of a negation of its negation. These binary oppositions were in the mind. So we're sitting there, I said, well, look, instead of, we were going to occupy ourselves outside of the university by teaching. And I said, instead of teaching out, I said, why don't we teach in? Teach in, occupy the buildings after class. It was also the period of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was on strike at that time, or which was sitting in the South, at that time. And so sit-in was important. It was also in Michigan, which was the site of some of the greatest labor actions, including the sit-in at the Flint plant in the 30s in American history. So the notion of teaching in, I said, let's teach in. So we all agreed to that, but then we had to convince the other 20-odd people, including people who had put themselves on the line and were vulnerable. So we had a meeting which followed the Student for a Democratic Society, which was also available at the time. Their procedure, which was always to make consensus by going around the room. So we started, I think, about 7 or 8 o'clock at night, and we went around the room. And about 5 o'clock in the morning, we finished. And at that time, everybody decided, okay, willing or not, this is what we'll do with teaching. So I was feeling bad. I went home, and I was sort of feeling bad because we had made some strong people retreat on their positions. And I thought, well, if we could just generalize this, maybe it'll make it seem like a better action and a more effective. So I called up Marvin Harris, my former teacher at Columbia, and I said, Marvin, we're going to have a teach, and he said, that's a great, on Vietnam. He said, that's a great idea. I didn't have to explain the idea. I just said that. He said, you mean you're going to occupy the classrooms? Yeah, I said, after class, we're going to do that. He said, a great idea. So by the time we had our teaching, which was something like March 24th or 5th, 1965, there were something like 24 teach-ins scheduled. And then we had a national teach-in in May in 1965 in Washington. And Arnie Kaufman and I, two small, rather overweight Jewish professors, sat in this hotel room and the phone ringing out. German television, CBC, Canadian television, public radio, public television. And we had a network of 230 campus radio stations hooked up, and we had a national teach-in about Vietnam. It was amazing. At that time, the Berkeley people were sort of, they had riot envy because we had, we had, preempted their free speech movement. So they had a teach-in afterwards of 35,000 people just to keep on top of us.
It's amazing. It's incredible, but it's and it is completely ongoing for you. And you already alluded to the Confucius Institute, which is, I mean, you're not just an activist who does things. You're an activist who gets things done.
Well,
because you just
I pick my fights.
Well, you pick them smartly. We'll end on this note. Give us a sense of what you just accomplished there, and it's again of global relevance.
Well, the Confucius Institutes, if you don't know, are a very successful program of the Chinese government to take over the teaching of Chinese language and culture in universities and K-12 schools. There are now about 450 of these worldwide in universities and about 100 in the United States. And there are something like 650 or 700 Confucius classrooms, that is Chinese language and culture instruction in secondary and primary schools. As it turns out, these Confucius Institutes involve Chinese-trained teachers trained by the headquarters of the Confucius Institute in Beijing, and they're supplied to universities, colleges, and lower schools. Their salaries and airfares paid, textbooks and curriculum provided. So in other words, these universities and schools around the world have subcontracted teaching to a foreign government, a government which is not exactly known for its respect for free thought, free expression, and free inquiry. These institutes advertise themselves as affiliated with the Chinese Ministry of Education. In fact, however, if you look at their own website, the Confucius Institutes are run by a governing council, which is headed by a member of the Politburo and consists of high officials of state, the ministries of various ministries and sub-ministers, vice ministers. And this council of approximately 13 members and 4 vice chairs and the chair from the Politburo gets the annual reports of the Confucius Institutes and sets the agenda. So that in fact, in making themselves, and universities and colleges have to vet their programs annually with the Confucius Institute, and the Confucius Institute bylaws require them to get the approval of Confucius Institute for all their activities, not only teaching, but a lot of lectures, shows, film showings, festival celebrations, and the like. So in fact, universities and schools have become subordinate branches of a political network that reaches to the highest levels of Chinese society and government. The problem is being compounded by the fact that this governing council consists of members who are themselves members of so-called small leading groups of the Chinese Communist Party, where the policies of the Confucius Institute are set. And it's by their membership in the party that they become bureaucratic officers in the Institute. So this is a very louche organization, very suspicious. And although the directors of Confucius Institutes here and elsewhere have argued that they're not under constraint and there have been no incidents from academic malpractice and that they're perfectly legitimate, I collected from many different places around the world, mostly in Europe and America, a number of many such incidents. In fact, there are thousands of incidents going on all the time because the teachers are trained to avoid the questions that are politically taboo in China. So somebody brings up, as we have a study in California, somebody brings up Tiananmen Square, they start talking about, as the students said, they keep on talking about the pretty bunnies. I think he meant the pandas. They avoid, they're trained to avoid and divert all these important questions about China, and therefore they really give a very false picture of a harmonious, beautiful China, and all of the difficulties imposed by the Chinese government. And it's that which I'm talking about, not, I'm not doing some McCarthyite number of anti-communism. My problem is the academic integrity of our schools and our universities. And constantly, if somebody in Ashtabula, Ohio, avoids a question or tells the people who are reporting on Tibet, don't talk about politics, just talk about the culture of Tibet or the art of Tibet, then we are involved in a massive movement of self-censorship, censorship, and worse. And in fact, in a recent episode in the European Association of Chinese Studies in Portugal, the head of the Confucius Institute came in, didn't like the program which she had co-sponsored, and tore up the program and the abstracts, pages out of the abstracts and program of this scholarly conference. So we're involved with something that I think is detrimental to our ideals of free inquiry, academic freedom, and academic integrity. Accordingly, I wrote a pamphlet which has just come out, and I must say I published it as well. I run a small press called Prickly Paradigm Press, which every once in a while I can use as my personal outlet. But I just published a short, or a 60-page pamphlet on the incidents of this kind. And the University of Chicago, there was a movement developed against this.
There was a Confucius Institute on
There is
campus.
a Confucius Institute here, or was. Which
Emphasis.
was up for renewal on the September 29th of this year. And as I mentioned, there was a protest that was tabled at the Council of the Senate, the faculty representative body, of 110 people, most of them full professors and a lot of them named chairs, asking that this not be renewed, this institute, in September. The university went into discussions about changing the contract in its benefit. According to the university officials, they were doing very well until the same woman who was the head of the Confucius Institute headquarters in Beijing that disrupted the Portuguese Scholarly Conference. A story was written about her in the Shanghai Communist Party newspaper called Liberation Daily, in which it claimed that she had intimidated the president of the University of Chicago by just telling him that if you believe these professors were protesting, then forget about it. And according to the administration of the university, this is what caused them to terminate their contract. That's their story.
But, I mean, you're underselling it slightly because, I'm a professor at the University of Illinois, and so this, you guys had a struggle here that you led. You wrote about it also in The Nation. Of course, what happens at places like University of Chicago, or Harvard University, or Princeton University, it signals. And I think, it may be too early, but I think you have ushered in the beginning of the end, certainly of the Confucius Institute as an institution as we know it in this country.
Well, that's optimistic. I hope you're right. But it is true that the problem with Chicago, for example, got a lot, even in its original contract 5 years ago, got a lot of concessions. For example, the standard contract has a secrecy clause, so that nobody knows what's in it, and you can't divulge it. And most of the faculty and most of the universities, including Chicago, didn't know what was going on because of this secrecy clause. But Chicago's contract didn't have a secrecy clause, which didn't prevent it from not broadcasting it. It didn't have a secrecy clause. Chicago ignored the provision that the textbooks for the courses taught by teachers provided by China to our program in Far Eastern languages. It ignored the textbooks that were sent or the curricula were sent, and it did what its own, it used its own textbooks and so on. So we had a lot of concessions, as did Stanford, who, for example, got $4 million a year out of China and so on. So the big universities got a lot of concessions in order for Knox College or some secondary school, including, incidentally, Chicago Public Schools. There are 43 Confucius classrooms being taught by Chinese teachers in Chicago Public Schools. So that they would say, oh, well, Chicago has it, it must be okay. It's important that we refuse that for whatever reason the administration wants to give out.
Well, we've reached this out, but if I don't mind letting stand as your last sentence, we should refuse that which is just being said as dogma. I mean, I think one thing that this episode shows us, is that, and we can talk about whether this is for you anthropology or politics, whether they're one and the same, whether they're continuous, but it, just as you described anthropology as being able to penetrate deeper into what seems, apparent and obvious, that we should refuse this kind of.
Yeah, I think that the anthropology was important here, not only because it involved deciphering the whole organization in a way, but also because one of the important studies of what was going on in Confucius classrooms was done by an anthropologist in California, and she wasn't completely against Confucius Institutes, but she talked about the fact that these teachers were trained in China, that the questions that came up that were in opposition to Chinese politics were refuted or ignored by or diverted by the teachers and so on. In other words, we had ethnographic experience of what was going on. And so anthropology played. But there were many more people than anthropologists involved. So.
Yeah. Okay, so we've reached the end of our time, but. I hope Marshall will hang out a little bit because we didn't have time for Q&A from the audience. But if people have questions, are you going to hang out with us for a little bit?
Yeah, I'll hang out in the corridor.
Wonderful, wonderful. So then, this was an amazing pleasure and honor. Thank you so much.
Thank you.